a real pleasure to obviously be part of this morning's event. We have been lucky enough to work with a range of people, a range of organisations, certainly over the last 18 months or so, in response to this current environment and the challenging environment we find ourselves operating within. The session that we're about to go through is one of really taking a lot of those key learnings in terms of working with people and understanding, well, what works? Essentially, what does it take to cope with such a challenging environment we find ourselves operating within? Now, I'm going to set myself a big challenge, and that as a consequence of you going through this session today, I'm hoping that everybody walks away with a slightly different insight. If I'm doing my job correctly, you all should walk away with a slightly different insight in terms of what is uniquely going to work for you. And that'll be a bit of a challenge in 40 minutes, but I'm confident we will absolutely get there. Equally so, I like to share really practical examples, and the way in which we want to go through this content is, there's nothing worse than listening to a very passionate speaker talk for, 40 minutes or so, and then wonder what you've got that's actually tangible as a consequence to use. I want to ensure that at the end of the session, you have something that you can tangibly use. And what we will do is I will refer to some of the worksheets that you can obviously take off the hub in terms of implement some of the things that we actually go through today. And that will be full of resources that you can actually access. As Ange rightly highlighted, feel free to just jump into that chat functionality. I will be asking a couple of questions along the way. So certainly feel free to engage in that chat. If you do have a question that you would like us to answer, jump into that Q&A. But in terms of sharing your thoughts and answering some of the questions I may pose, please jump into that chat functionality. Rightio, let's get underway. So I first want to talk just a little bit about stress. And I think it's really important to position our current understanding in terms of stress. And really the stress response, or the severity of that stress response, is due to that interaction between our sources of stress and the type of person we are. That interaction determines that severity of that stress response. And as you can appreciate, many of us are experiencing a number of sources of stress currently based upon the environment in which we find ourselves operating within. Now, often a number of those sources of stress in which we encounter are often things that we don't always have control over. Now, those people that are most vulnerable to experiencing some of those more severe indicators tend to be those people that very much focus on the left-hand side of that equation. Today's session is very much focused on the right-hand side of the equation. Now, don't get me wrong, best case scenario, we address both sides, both our sources of stress and the type of person we are. What we've found during COVID, however, is a lot of those sources of stress are things that we don't have absolute control over. So today's session is very much going to be focused on the right-hand side of that equation to help minimize that severity of that stress response. What I've certainly noticed is that COVID is very topical. And also a lot of those more environmental factors tend to be the number one topic of conversation. And we spend a lot of our time being very externally focused in terms of what's currently happening in our environments. We all tend to tune in at 1 o'clock to see the latest update, as we wait patiently to hear what the latest numbers are. Now, I often ask people, well, what would happen if we actually, instead of listening for half an hour at 1 o'clock every day, we actually invested that 1 hour or half an hour in ourselves? And we actually stood back and took a bit of an evaluation in terms of where we were currently at, and took the time to identify things that may help us and benefit us during what is obviously very challenging environment. So this is a session whereby we're going to be focused on you as an individual, not your significant other, not your children, not your manager, not your employer, but you as an individual. And my goal is to give you the insight in terms of what is uniquely going to work for you. What I find in this current industry, in this current environment, there is a lot of people talking about what people should and shouldn't be doing to cope. Where we tend to miss the gap, however, is understanding what is uniquely going to work for each individual. And that requires to look internally and understand what that looks like for you. So I'm hoping to provide you with that framework to do today, so you're better equipped to obviously manage that more effectively. So when we do tend to experience stress, we tend to experience certain symptoms. What I'd love you to do actually is just jump into that chat functionality if you feel comfortable. What sort of symptoms do you see in people when they experience stress? What are some of the things that you observe in people when you know that they're actually experiencing stress of some form? Just jump into that chat functionality. Feel free. Yes, thank you, Lisa. People feel irrational. They short fuse. They become a little bit more emotional. They get angry. They become on edge. Good one, Tony, in terms of them socially withdrawing. Tense skin, most definitely. Haunching over, Angela. Yeah, nice, good suggestion. In terms of becoming quiet, Holly, you're absolutely right. People tend to withdraw a little bit from that situation. Now, that is depending on what stage they're actually at. Amy, yeah, they work too much. Sometimes they become immersed in one area and they have trouble kind of understanding what to prioritize. They look tired. I think they actually are tired. Losing sleep, most definitely, depending on what stage you're at. So some people may be unable to sleep. Others will want to sleep too much. They drink more. Yes, absolutely. We start resorting to those things that kind of give us that feeling of well-being, if you like, albeit a very short-term strategy, as you can appreciate. They become a little bit more aggressive, yeah, a little bit more irritable, short-tempered, which then in itself can become a source of stress. Great contribution, team. Thank you for doing that. What we know is that people tend to experience different indicators of stress, but we tend to go through the similar stages. So let's just go through those stages quickly. The first one being the alarm phase. Very much associated with that fight or flight type response, something that we're very much evolutionary wired to achieve. So our body undergoes certain physiological responses in order to prepare us to fight or to take flight. If we move through that, however, we move into what's called the stress arousal stage. And that's where those indicators change just a little bit. So we have that persistent irritability, anxiety, that bruxism, that grinding of the teeth at night, heart palpitations, inability to concentrate, insomnia. So that's where we're having difficulty sleeping, periods of high blood pressure, forgetfulness, and headaches. Headaches is a key indicator for me. As soon as I experience a headache, I know I need to do something different. As we move on, energy conservation. This is where things change somewhat. So you'll see that lateness for work, needed 3-day weekends, persistent tiredness in the morning. We start drinking more coffee, more sugary foods, more sugary drinks. Why? Because our energy levels are going down. We start procrastinating more, decreased sexual desire. Most people don't admit that, but that is a common indicator. Social withdrawal, so we start pulling away from those people around us, resentfulness and apathy. And if we move through that stage, we move into that exhaustion phase. Now, why I want to share this with you is what's particularly important is that we're clear and understand what our own unique indicators are. In my experience, what we tend to find is that people often don't recognize those indicators until they reach that energy conservation or exhaustion phase. And then they hear things like, well, you should go out and exercise more, or you should go and talk to someone, or you should delegate more. The very things that we're being told to do are particularly hard to do because of those indicators. So we need to understand that sequential nature of the indicators that we experience, because it's feedback that something has to change. Get familiar with what those indicators are. We will provide you a worksheet where you can just go through and tick what you see as being your unique indicators. What I'd also encourage you to do is to go and put it in front of a significant other or someone who knows you well. Chances are they'll be able to identify a lot more than what you've actually identified yourself. We're often familiar in those indicators in other people, but not so much in ourselves. So I'd certainly encourage you to do that. So that will be the first thing. For me, as I mentioned, headaches is a key indicator. As soon as I experience a headache, I know I need to do something differently based upon obviously what we're about to go through. Otherwise, I'm vulnerable to moving through those stages. Use those responses as feedback. Also, just to kind of give you a bit of an insight, a 15-minute brisk walk outside in the middle of the day is great for releasing endorphins, that alarm stress arousal phase, not, pretty good. A 15-minute brisk walk outside in the sunshine just isn't going to cut it at the energy conservation and exhaustion phase. You need a much more intensive strategy to put in place. Let's keep going. So we'll provide you with that worksheet. Now, ultimately, a lot of the work that we do for the organisations in which we work with, we focus on our 10 healthy habits, and that underpins everything that we do. And as you can currently see on screen, many of you, for those of you that are paying attention, you will only see 8. The reason why there's only 8 is I'm going to focus on the last 2. The focus of this session is going to be on the last 2. I think many of us have heard about the importance of promoting things like healthy eating, reducing fake food, scheduling in exercise and trying to promote sleep quality and so on. I don't want to focus on those things for now, but we can make a resource available to you that gives you some insights and some tips on how you can achieve those healthy habits. I want to focus on the last 2, however, because I've seen, based upon the work that we've been doing over the last 18 months, that these 2 healthy habits tend to have the biggest influence on how people feel, biggest influence on their degree of resilience and their ability to cope with what is a very changing and variable environment. So let's make a start on those. I do want to challenge you, however. What I'd love you to do is just to see if you can solve this for me first. Okay, I'd love you to just pay attention and have a look at this and see if you can solve this puzzle. I want you to cross out 6 letters to make an English word. Okay, don't put it in the chat. If you get it, please don't put it in the chat. But ultimately, just see if you can solve this. Cross out 6 letters to make an English word. See if you can do that for me. I'll give you a chance to answer that in a second. Okay, so here you go. Cross out 6 letters to make an English word. Okay, I'm going to give you about another 20 seconds or so. Great contribution in the chat, by the way. Please keep that coming. Okay, so, alrighty, if you think you've got it, throw it into the chat. See if you can solve that. I'll give you the answer in a moment. Well done, Kay. Well done, banana. Well done. So I'll just show you. So if we cross out 6 letters, so we're going to remove 6 letters, it leaves banana. Many of you are thinking, why are we doing this? What is the point in doing this? Why is he doing this in this presentation? Well, it's a nice segue into the topic of managing your thinking. What I'd love you to do is just to reflect somewhat in terms of what you thought about when I asked you to see if you can solve that challenge. Many of you might have thought, oh, I'm really good at doing these. Let me do it. I think I can do it. Some of you would have thought, oh, yeah, I'm not very good at puzzles. Others may have just thought, no, I can't be bothered. Brad will tell me in a minute anyway. Now, just reflect somewhat on what you first thought during that task. It's a nice segue, as I mentioned, into manage your thinking. What I want to highlight to you is that ultimately we think a lot during the day. We are consistently thinking. In fact, the research shows we have between 20,000 and 70,000 thoughts per day. You're thinking right now, you're judging me as a person, you're evaluating the content that I'm presenting to you, you're constantly thinking in terms of asking yourself questions around what I'm presenting now. Now, obviously, we can't get to the end of the day and write down our 20,000 thoughts. A lot of our thinking happens at that subconscious level where we're not paying attention to it, but it still has a big impact on how we feel across the course of our day. Now, we know that at that subconscious level, because we're not objectively paying attention to those thoughts, they're vulnerable to becoming very irrational. And even the smartest people that I've worked with, including at ASB, we are vulnerable to becoming more irrational in our thinking when we're objectively not paying attention to it. We're all vulnerable to that, and it has a big influence in terms of how we feel. So what is particularly important is to understand, well, what is the impact of that habitual thinking? And let me give you a quick example. I like to use examples of this. A few years back now, I was lucky enough to do some work with ACC. This was a few years back. We were working with this long-term claimants on ACC. So they've been injured in the workplace, and they were on a program to get them back into the workplace. I remember working with this one lady who'd been on ACC for 16 years. And she came into my office one day and she was visibly upset. She'd been crying. And I asked her, well, you know, what was wrong? And it turned out she was giving her kids breakfast in the morning, got a sharp pain in her wrist, dropped the plate of food, smashed in the ground, burst onto tears. So we talked a little bit about habitual thinking and the impact of habitual thinking, and we kind of went back and I used a few techniques to get her back to that moment in time. And I asked her, what was her first thought when she first dropped that plate of food? And she initially struggled with that, but then said, well, my first thought was I was going to be late for your appointment. So I just wrote it down on a piece of paper and I said, well, what else? And she said, well, the kids are going to be late for school. What else? I'm never going to get the career that I want. Alarm bells start ringing. What else? I'm never going to have the lifestyle that I want. I'm never going to get the career that I want. I'm never going to be able to travel, and so on and so on and so on. And it got to the point where the last two things on your list were, my kids will not respect me. My kids will not love me. Pain, kids don't love me. Pain, kids don't love me. I put the list back in front of her. She burst into tears again at the realization of the nature of her habitual thinking and the impact that that was having on her. Again, we're all vulnerable to experiencing those negative habits of thought, and in a lot of situations, we're just not aware of them. So how do we know that we may be having perhaps some of that thinking is not working for us? Well, we experience some of those negative indicators of stress. Hence why it's important to know what your indicators are. So for me, as soon as I get a headache, I objectively evaluate what I've been focused on, what I've been thinking about. Now, how do we break it down? Let's assume that we've identified a negative habit of thought. If we're experiencing all of those negative indicators like I'm irrational, I'm tired, I'm aggressive, I'm not sleeping well, I'm withdrawing, and someone turns around to me and says, Brad, just be more positive, unfortunately, that's not going to work. In fact, it's probably going to exacerbate my stress indicators. So we've found the best way. On a piece of paper, don't try and do it in your head, but on a piece of paper. When you experience an event, let's say lockdown, you might observe things like, I can't cope, this is never going to end, I'm never going to be able to get through this. What is the emotional response associated with that? Now, the goal is to come up with alternatives that contradict that existing habit of thought. The more alternatives you come up with, the more likely you are to break that habit of thought down. And the goal is to come up with as many alternatives as you possibly can. And while many of you may be, dialing in today saying, well, there are none, there are always some. We just have to look harder. And I'm going to give you some examples of that in a moment. This is another practical example. This was a good friend of mine. We went to university together. He went into management consulting. I set up Synergy Health. This was a particular situation where he went, he got the opportunity to go overseas, whereby he could work for quite a prestigious consulting firm over there. Very smart guy. Got over there, was there for 3 months, then was made redundant. He was ringing me up consistently, telling me how stressed he was, about how he had no security, was very anxious, and obviously about the situation he found himself in. So one particular day I was busy setting up Synergy Health, so I actually said to him, I said, hey, I'm pretty busy. How about you go away and write down 20 things that are positively associated with having no security whatsoever? His response to that was, yeah, right. My response to him was, well, you haven't got a job, you've got plenty of time, give it a go. We're very good mates, so there's no problem in saying that. He came back by the end of the day with 25, as you can see on the screen. Things like, it gives way to creativity, it drives a cycle of renewal, it gives way to creativity, ensures we never stagnate, and so on and so on. Didn't solve his problem, but it put him in a slightly better position to cope with the challenging environment he was in. And this isn't about completely eliminating stress. It's just about putting you in a slightly better position to cope with the challenges that you may encounter. I've got another quick little activity that I'd love you to do. I'd love you, wherever you are right now, as long as you're not driving, let me just say that. I'd love you to look around your environment now. And what I'd love you to do is identify everything that you can see that's coloured red. Just look around your environment, look for everything that you can see that's coloured red, make a mental note of it. Make a mental note of it. Okay, I'd love you to make a mental note of that. Everything that you can see coloured red. Okay, looking around, great. Right, what I'd love you to do now is to close your eyes, and then what I'd like you to do is to go through that mental checklist and basically remember and list in your own thoughts everything that you saw that was coloured blue. All right. Many of you will be thinking, yeah, but you asked us red. Well, yeah, absolutely. I asked you to focus on the red. That doesn't mean that there isn't any blue stuff in your environment. You were just focused on that. And that is a good example in terms of what you focus on is what you feel. When you are focused on those things that aren't going well, you will feel like things aren't going well. So a good activity and a great way in order to kind of help in terms of building that resilience is focusing on the things or the opportunities that potentially this environment gives you. Now, I know in many cases that is going to be a challenging thing to do. Write it down on a piece of paper. It is significantly easier if you write it down on a piece of paper. I'd encourage you to do that. Right, I want to get onto this next habit. And again, we'll give you the opportunity to flesh some of this out if you have specific questions you want to ask. But I do want to talk about this last habit because, again, it has a huge impact on the strategies in which people can put in place. And that is engage yourself. And that is really underpinned by values or personal values. Now, let's talk a little bit about personal values first. So what we know about personal values is they're shaped by our life experiences. All right, they're shaped by our life experiences. Because we've all had different value or different life experiences, we're all going to have different values. That makes sense. Because we've had different experiences, we all have different values. Do our values change? Well, yes, they do. What does it take to change our values? More experiences. And as we start getting older, what it takes to change someone's values is what we refer to as being a heightened emotional event, because that could be positive or it can be negative, but our values certainly change over time. Now, they guide our every decision. So every decision that you make is influenced by what your personal values are. So if you've got the option between A or B, whichever one gives you a higher degree of value fulfillment is the option that you would want to choose. When you're promoting those values, both inside and outside the work environment, it significantly increases engagement, resilience, happiness, and mental health. When those personal values aren't being promoted, we are more susceptible to those stress indicators. We are more susceptible to experiencing some of those mental health challenges and disengagement and a number of those challenges that we may be encountering, particularly in this environment. So it's kind of important we know what those values are because they influence our behaviour and ultimately our overall well-being. So I'd love you to just jump in the chat again for me and just let me know, do you know what your personal values are? Jump into that chat and tell me, do you know what your personal values are, with a yes or a no? Do you know what your personal values are? No, thanks, Kelly. Great, we're getting lots of yeses. We're getting some no's. Fantastic. Fantastic. Yes, yes. Excellent. Depending on the situation. Good point, Jessica. I think a lot of people will often know when those values are being compromised. They'll often know when those values are being compromised. Good one. Yes, 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 fantastic. This is the type of response that I would expect. Most people, I think, intuitively know what their personal values are. My question and my follow-up question to this always is, do you know your personal values well enough to strategically design your week? Do you know what happens in your week to directly promote the things that are uniquely important to you as an individual? And in my experience, that is often where people struggle. They don't have the clarity or they haven't invested the time to specifically understand the personal values that are uniquely important to them. Then they're vulnerable to becoming like an onion. And let me just explain what that means. We know that when people's personal values have been compromised in some way, they start building those layers on that onion. What are those layers? Well, they're some of those indicators of stress that we may experience. Then what we tend to do is we start focusing on the things that are creating that stress. And of course, we will always find them. Then the vulnerability is we're starting to present these surface-related issues that actually have nothing to do with what's actually going on at the core. And of course, then we're trying to deal with all those surface-related issues and wondering why we're not really feeling any better or getting a resolution. A good example, I had a fellow come into my office one day. He was completely frustrated with his manager, disengaged with his job, feeling incredibly frustrated, experiencing a lot of those indicators. And I asked him, I said, well, what's causing that? And he said, oh, the manager shifted the coffee without even telling me. I was like, whoa, are you okay? Are you coping with that? As it turned out for him, he was someone who was getting a high degree of value fulfillment on a value that he had around being creative. A new manager came in and started diluting that part of his role. He was starting to experience those negative indicators, was looking for reasons as to why he was feeling that way, and started presenting these surface-related issues. Right. So it's easy to really lose that focus when we don't have clarity around what those values are. So what we're going to do is we're going to make available to you this sheet. We're going to make it available to you with the instructions on how you can start the process of identifying what your true personal values are. And it will take you through that exercise and give you a starting point as to what those values may look like. And I'm going to show you why that's important. In my experience, however, the single best way to truly get an insight in terms of what those values are is that when you're feeling good, ask yourself what values have been promoted. When you're feeling frustrated, ask yourself what values have been compromised. Now, if that's the only thing that you learn from this session, you'll be better off for it. When I feel good, I'm going to ask myself what values are being promoted. When I feel frustrated, I'm going to ask myself what values have actually been compromised. And what can you do with that information? Well, we know we all have our own little wellbeing bucket. When we're promoting those values, it tops that bucket up. But life being life, however, we're going to experience events that compromise those values, that drain that bucket. So we need to ensure there's more going in than there is coming out. And that is going to be different for everybody. And that is an important part of this session. So let's think about COVID for a moment. Now, let's say if you were someone who valued control and you'd spent a long time in level 4 lockdown. I suspect you're somewhat challenged by that. What say you are someone who valued security and you were unsure in terms of, around job security, or you had your significant other potentially going to lose their job? I suspect you would be fairly challenged by that right now. Or what say you were someone who valued recognition, and when you work on site within the workplace, you've got a cracking manager that provides you ongoing feedback or positive feedback across the course of the day. And then all of a sudden you're working remotely at home, wondering why you're not as engaged in your job. Our environment has a big influence on our ability to proactively promote our personal values. When we don't have clarity around what they are, we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable to our bucket draining. And I'm going to give you some examples. Again, an important slide to really hone into. A changing environment requires us to find new ways to achieve personal value fulfillment. This is why so many people struggle in terms of coping with change. It requires them to find new ways to promote the things that are important to them. And let me give you some larger examples, I guess. When we go from work life to retirement, we know that those that are highly engaged in their job and their work life, when they go on to retirement, two things tend to happen. The first one is that ultimately they typically want to get back to work. Or number two, they die early. And the research supports that. So if we're going to manage that transition more effectively, what we do is we'd look at the values that are being promoted in our work life and then ask the question before we retire, how are we going to promote those values in retirement and ideally increase the degree of value fulfillment. What about this one? Children at home to children leaving home. Many of you might be going, well, that's a celebration. Others perhaps will be experiencing what we call empty nest syndrome. What is empty nest syndrome? Well, empty nest syndrome is essentially you've relied on your children to promote your personal values. Then that vehicle's gone and you're left feeling empty. That is what empty nest syndrome actually is. Our next one, working off-site and then working on-site, then working off-site, and then potentially going back and forward. This is where our environment has a huge impact on our ability to promote those personal values. So the question is, how are you promoting those things on-site versus off-site? How are you strategically designing your week to promote the things that are uniquely important to you? Again, particularly important. What we know is that across the course of the year, and especially during COVID, and this is why people are certainly challenged right now, is there's these massive swings in our environments. It could change tonight. It could change tonight, like it has for Auckland this morning. It's a new environment. And of course, across the course of the year, it is different for everybody. Why? Because we've got different personal values. But what we do need to have is an understanding as to what strategy is uniquely going to work for us based upon what those personal values are. That's where I'd encourage you to invest your energy in terms of getting the best return on any strategy you put in place, So what we want at our disposal is easy access to strategies that work. So we want to ensure we're putting as much in the top of that bucket to enable to cope for those challenges that potentially compromise those values. The more we put in, the less likely those values are to be compromised. Now, let me give you some practical examples just to finish off, because it's important to understand that when it's a values-based strategy, it has a huge impact. So let's say if you were someone that valued control, and I saw this circulating social media, and it reminded me of when I did some coaching work many years ago. But ultimately, what I found, if I identified someone valued control, the first thing that I'd do is ask them to write down a big long list of all the things that they were worried about. Typically, you can cross out 60 to 70% off that list because they're things that they can't actually control. They would literally unwind in front of me. It was the easiest money I ever made. It was a values-based strategy. It would work for those people particularly well. If you're someone that values control, the best thing you could do at the start of each day is just make a list of all the things that you've got control of that day and focus on those things if control was important to you. Let's say that you're someone who values security and you don't know what's going to happen. How do you promote security? You scenario plan. If A happens, I'm going to do B or C. If B happens, I'm going to do 1 or 2. If 1 happens, I'm going to do 3 or 4. So by scenario planning, you've got a plan in place regardless of the potential outcome. Here's a list of additional strategies based upon values. Again, they can be very simple, very easy to implement as long as they're values-based. And it's important to understand what those values are and design that environment that directly promotes those personal values. You will absolutely benefit from that. They don't need to be complicated. They just need to be values-based. And again, we'll make this available to you so you can see that. I know many of you have got challenges between that whole tension between employee and parents. And I think it's important to understand, well, that's a values conflict. Typically what can happen is we're fulfilling certain values through our work and certain values through being a parent. All of a sudden, those worlds have been brought together and there's values conflict going on. Promoting one potentially compromises the other. And that actually makes it incredibly challenging in order to balance those things. So a couple of tips. I'm going to give some practical tips as well. Give yourself permission to prioritize the things that are uniquely important to do. You should always do that. Make sure you lock those into your week, no matter how busy you are. Okay. In fact, the more busy you are, the more important it is to lock those things in your week. You don't want to stop putting things in the top of your bucket when it's draining the most. Right? It's a common trap we fall into. Proactively promote the values that are as much as you can. Don't focus on one value at the expense of all of the others. So ultimately, just don't focus on that one value and potentially compromise the next 4 or 5. That'll become clearer as you work through and get clarity on what those values are. Reinforce that self-directed play is important for childhood development. And I know talking to some parents, they are just so relieved at this very point. You don't have to consistently entertain your children all day long. A key developmental step for children is for them to discover what they can do. come up with things for them to do on their own. So it is a key fundamental developmental step, and I know many parents feel pressured to control their children's day, particularly during lockdown, so be aware of that. Just a couple of quick top tips. Create a timetable and make it easy for everyone to see what's occurring through the day. Get the buy-in from your children. Create a separate work area if that's actually possible, or put an obvious sign on when you are actually working, because it helps you create those boundaries between I'm working, I'm focused on work, I'm getting value fulfillment through this, versus I'm focusing on you children, obviously. One of the things we've had our clients do, for example, is for the parent and the child, maybe as an activity, to create a flag or a sign that gets put up when they're actually working. A good way to create those firm boundaries. Again, getting a list of the things that your children perhaps want to do, so that when you're investing time in them, you're doing the things you know they want to do. And finally, the best possible strategies are obviously spending time with your children, but promoting your own personal values. They are absolutely the best possible strategies. So a couple of things to think about when it comes to those personal values, and understanding why that challenge exists, particularly for parents in a lockdown scenario. But these are values-based strategies. I want to really just kind of summarize a couple of things before we get into a bit of a Q&A. One, first and foremost, is determine your level of control. So many try to control the uncontrollable, and we often see that, particularly when it comes to, during lockdowns, people that value control, think about their bucket. What tends to happen is when that starts draining, they start trying to control more in their environment, which just leaves them more vulnerable. Identify your indicators of stress. We're going to make that available to you so you can go through that worksheet and just identify what those indicators are, knowing that the sooner you can recognize those indicators, the sooner you can put a strategy in place, the more effective it's actually going to be. What has been the nature of your habitual thinking patterns? When you experience those negative indicators, get into the habit of thinking about what you've been thinking about. If you feel it's not working for you, change your focus by writing down those alternatives, but please do it on a piece of paper. Don't do it in your head. You will lose focus, and essentially you will just disengage from the process. You'll be like, oh, what did that Brad guy tell me? Oh, I can't be bothered. And what action can you take to enhance the fulfillment of your personal values? The more you can create an environment that does that, the better off you will absolutely be. And sometimes that means being creative, but that's for you to focus on and for you to create. Unfortunately, I think we often find ourselves relying on others to promote those values without necessarily understanding that. We often rely on our partners, our job, our managers, our employers. But what's most important is we take ownership of that, take the time to understand what that is, and then build the strategies to promote those things, especially in a changing environment.